Gula by Chrysostomos Tsaprailis. The Agrafa Mountains. Kufyam urged the heavily laden mule onward. As always, the animal was reluctant to cross the narrow bridge. It was as if it could sense something within the old mossy stones that spanned the rushing river. Perhaps the human life that had been forced within the foundations at the beginning of the bridge's construction was still reaching out to animals and people of a fey disposition. After all, his own father had not set foot on this bridge for more than half a century, not since a nocturnal crossing when a spectral cacophony had chased him all the way to the nearby hamlet of Vlesto. The bridge was a thing of great craftsmanship, a grand arc of arm-shaped stones, masterfully weaved. Whenever he was traveling the other way, leaving his birthplace behind, the bridge held the promise of new vistas and sights, of the road that spanned 3 successive mountain tops before reaching the town of Muzaki, the closest hub of civilization, the place from where Kufyam was now returning. Now, it marked the imminent end of Kufyam's trek. After the crossing, it was just one more hour of steep climb until he reached his home. Before the war, he used to make the journey 3 times a year, early spring, midsummer, and late autumn, to sell bundles of the scarlet-dyed cloth his village was famous for, and to buy seasonal supplies, olive oil, salt, and pepper, the odd metal tool. During winter, the mountain passes were snow-locked, the road effectively impassable. He had only braved it once under such hibernal conditions, though it had been no decision of his. It was a February, 2 years ago, after the end of the war. Kufyam had been carried home, half dead from starvation, on the back of a mule, his weight negligible after the months he had stayed imprisoned in a cell deep within the mountains of northwestern Greece. Kufyam was the eldest of his brothers, doomed to remain in the village as master and slave of the family land, while his younger siblings were off for studies and prestigious jobs in the great cities of the north. He had felt cheated, his primogeniture nothing but a curse imposed upon him by the ancestral ghosts that regulated, generation after generation, the lives of the village families. He had hated the land, tainted as it was with blood, witchcraft, and terrible saints. There were horrible tales weaved upon each path, each field, each edifice, stories that had been imposed upon his youthful self by his family. He remembered long winter nights, his grandmother and aunt working the looms next to the fireplace, speaking of how the dead were marching through the village, stopping outside each house to look through the keyhole. When war had broken out, Kufyam had welcomed it as a ticket to new places and experiences far from the land he loathed. 2 years of military action and some months of imprisonment had changed his mind. When he had reached home, Kufyam was a skeletal thing, terrible to gaze upon, an image of death come into hearth. His aunt had kept all windows and mirrors covered so that the fleeting soul of her nephew would not find a passage to fly away. His grandmother had muttered prayers to her horrendous saints, to the pale moon, her whispered voice half pleading, half commanding. Slowly, he had been nursed back to health, to physical well-being, though the specter of war still nested in his eyes. After his recovery, Kufyam began seeing the land around the village with different eyes, as if his tribulation had painted the mountainside with fresh pigments. He started walking leisurely the innumerable little paths that crossed the fields. He basked in the shadow of fir-covered crags dotted with eagle eyries, savoring the precipitous landscape. He had grown fond of the mist, the breath of the mountains that descended upon the stone buildings, obscuring sight and hearing, blending the line between life and death. The stories of his childhood still haunted the land, but their murmuring had receded, respecting his ordeal. The journeys to Muzaki had lost the luster they once held for his younger, pre-war self. He was now reluctant, a creature hesitant to abandon its cradle. It had taken him 2 years to dare the trip, and now, after 5 days of absence, he was anxious to reach his hearth, to roam once again the places of his ancestors, to continue weaving his existence firmly into the stony fabric of his haunts. His trip had been blessed with clear if frosty weather, raising his hopes for an early return. But, as he crossed the bridge, briskly treading before the obstinate mule, dark clouds rolled furiously from the northwest, from the bald mountains of Epirus, to the place of his wartime imprisonment. He urged the animal on the ascending path, quickening his own stride. So close to the river, the narrow road, more of a forest path than anything else, winded snake-like through hazel trees, which gradually gave way to kermes oaks and firs as the traveler gained in altitude. It was said to have been carved ages ago by a gigantic finger that had reached from the heavens to guide the steps of his ancestors when they first crossed the river. 5 days ago, when he had passed on his way to Muzaki, Kufyam had noticed that the heavy winter had not been kind to the road. Now its condition was even worse. The path, choked with broken branches and blackberry bushes, was more suited to the passage of roe deer and boars. There must have been heavy storms during the 5 days of his absence, watery siblings of the one that was now fast approaching. He made good progress for a while, his steps easily contesting with the slow drizzle. But as he reached a large clearing, the location of a long-abandoned settlement, whose inhabitants had disappeared before his time, he resolutely suppressed some half-remembered memories about a pestilence that had risen, fog-like, from a crack in the earth. The seething storm caught up with him. It was a vicious downpour, accompanied by a ravenous northern wind, which forced its way through the openings of his goat-hair cape, burning his skin with frost. Kufyam looked around for any sign of shelter. The crumbling walls offered no cover. He backtracked, guiding the mule under the light cover of trees, and started retreating downhill, half blind by the rain. The trail was lost amidst newly born streams, as dangerous as river currents. Drenched, tediously fighting his way through prickly boughs, he glimpsed the silhouette of an edifice on his left. The tall stone building stood in a furze-filled opening, the far side of which could not be seen through the hazy curtain of rain. As he approached, he saw that there were more structures rising behind the first one, all of them in seemingly intact condition. He made a dash for the nearest entrance, mule harness in hand. He found himself in an arcade leading to an oval yard, surrounded by the silhouettes of tall, windowless walls. Cold, hard stone was ever present. The place felt, not built, but carved out of rock. This was no mere forsaken settlement. The abundance of corridors interspersed with eerie holy icons, the intact stone facades with the narrow window slits, the rusted bells, and the enclosures with the dry cisterns that were revealed to him as he wandered, bespoke of a religious communal complex, most probably an abandoned monastery, of which, however, he had heard nothing in his 30 years of age. The sky darkened as he reached the entrance of what he took to be the temple of the Cenobium. A small graveyard lay adjacent to the left side of the building. Rough, crossless tombstones spread outwards up to the far edge of the clearing, where a patch of ash trees marked the reinstatement of the forest. He tied the mule at the spire of a cistern that lay beneath a sturdy-looking balcony and entered the temple, removing his cap with reverence. The hall was devoid of religious icons, of stalls and prayer books, of priests and the devoted. Apart from subtle signs of past Christian worship, like the resurrection cross that had been burnt on the rock above the threshold, and a broken, dusty reliquary, empty, as he realized by looking through the smoky glass, the only part reminiscent of a church's interior was the wooden panel separating the nave from the sanctuary, the iconostasis. Nature had claimed the space. There were bushes of blackberries growing through cracks in the stone tiles, veins of diseased ivy emerging through broken animal skulls to climb the walls, seeking the light of the narrow windows up high. The iconostasis was covered in moss, fungal growths, and a kind of vine Kufyam didn't recognize. It was the first time he saw such a naked, deserted church. Its desolation rippled through his soul. It was as if the temple, the building itself, had fasted until the brink of death, removing almost all signs of previous use, all past spiritual fat, until only a husk remained, an empty shell which nature could start fill with its own pigments and utensils. Indeed, as minutes passed, Kufyam realized that the place still felt sanctified, albeit in a raw, primeval manner. The vegetal smell, the odor of animal droppings, a few yellow bones, these formed the incense of a forest temple where death and life were locked in a perpetual wheel of gluttony. From the open window, he spied the faded stones of an adjacent courtyard. He wondered if they had also been evacuated, the bones carried deep within the earth, the holes empty once more, ready to receive new offerings. A loud thunder interrupted his musings. Turning his attention to the iconostasis, he approached it with circumspect steps, careful to avoid the thorny blackberry bushes. He lit his lantern using flint and pyrite and examined the wooden surface. There were no religious icons, no crosses engraved, no remains of vigil lamps. Still, there seemed to be something beneath the vine that covered the royal gate, the central of the 3 doorways leading to the sanctuary. He carefully cleared the plant with knife and hand. What was unveiled made him take a sudden step back, bewildered. It was a folio-sized portrait of a dead man, painted directly on the wood of the gate, framed in plain, unadorned silver. The picture background was an emptiness of nondescript yellow pastels, akin to that of religious icons. The face depicted was haggard, emaciated, a thing of gray skin and bones, twisted by deprivation. The eyes were closed, the taut eyelids evoking pain and anguish, a surrender to the slow, inevitable march of hunger. It was a face devoid of nourishment, the image of despair, or holiness, if one thinks of starvation as a path to sanctification. It was a face he knew. A face that had haunted his dreams for the past 2 years, the face of the man he had been imprisoned with. His mind flew back to the mountain outpost where he had spent the months of his captivity. The man he had shared his cell with was a stranger, probably close to his age. They spoke the same language, but had exchanged no stories from their past, not even names. "I have no desire to burden you with my life," the man had said when Kufyam tried to make conversation, "to taint your spirit with my memories and the phantoms of loved ones that long for my return. I have no desire to deposit such a weight upon your flesh. Trust me, if death claims you, you don't want to be burdened with my own deeds, name, and remembrances. God knows, they are heavy enough." Kufyam had respected the man's strange wish, and had in turn revealed nothing to him about his own life. In the end, he had survived, while the other man had succumbed to hunger. Regarding now, once again, the macabre countenance of his companion, he was filled with a religious terror blunted by heavy remorse and an almost ecstatic sense of sanctity. He touched the painted surface reverently. He thought it proper to make an offering to the icon, to the man with which he had spent the most traumatic part of his life. He removed from his pack a loaf of unleavened bread, the last of his provisions, and placed it on a small patch of earth on the floor in the front of the royal gate, where a stone tile was missing, claimed by hand or nature. He knelt, his eyes entranced by the macabre face. He felt like whispering a few words, but knew of no prayer fit for this occasion or proper for this temple. Thinking back on the past few hours, he settled on a story of this land of his. He would divulge one of the tales that haunted him since early childhood, one of the terrors his grandmother had unveiled in whispered tunes next to the fireplace. Slowly, hesitant in the beginning, his words gained momentum as the old narration flowed through him. He spoke of the construction of a bridge, of a woman imprisoned in its foundations, buried alive to let the ford stand for centuries according to a saint's decree. It was a simple offering, bread and words for a dead man who, as far as Kufyam was concerned, was devoid of memories and life, a husk as empty as this church he stood in. He felt he owed him this and something more. Indeed, as he stood in contemplation, he decided that he would reinstate this abandoned temple in the memory and honor of the other prisoner. He would create a private sanctuary for his fallen comrade. Outside, the rain had stopped. The light was quickly dissipating, the sun already hidden behind the surrounding mountain peaks. Charting an uphill course, Kufyam was careful to mark down the path he followed, with subtle signs on trees, rocks, and forest floor. It was a full week before Kufyam found time to visit the temple once more. Spring was the busiest time of the year. Animals were giving birth, the land had to be tilled, up in the plateau pastures, shepherd huts had to be examined, the winter damage assessed and repaired before the herdsmen returned from the lowlands where they were overwintering. The whole village took a respite on the 25th of March, the Annunciation Day, which was celebrated with panegyric celebrations. After the morning liturgy, people headed to the village square where benches had already been set and roasting fires had been kindled. Clarinet and violin picked up jubilant melodies, while children started climbing in trees, rooftops, and smoking chimneys. Kufyam loved the festival, the dances that were soon to start. He longed for them as he did every year. In their spirals, he felt as part of something greater, contributing to the mediation between community and land for wealthy bounty. However, this year he would abstain from the festivities, for he well remembered how languid he used to feel after the celebratory excess. He knew that come afternoon, most of the villagers would retire for a nap, which was bound to turn into a long-winded slumber till next morning. The indolence would spread into the animals and seep into the land until all was silent and still. He needed his wits, his energy. Claiming malaise, he went back home. The people knew that he hadn't recovered his disposition since the war, and no reproaching words were uttered. He picked up his old rifle, along with some food and 3 candles he had filched from the church, and then set off through the yews at the south end of the settlement, his trail invisible from the village square. He followed the steep path until the houses were lost from sight. Then he turned left and made a slow descent, traversing a southeast ravine, an old hunting haunt of his. Following the marks he had left, he continued downhill, towards the temple complex where the portrait was waiting. The monastery looked uncanny in the clarity of the bright morning. He was reminded of rigid clothes filled with bones, left too long under the summer sun. As he circled the clearing, he realized that the complex was larger than he had assumed. He counted at least 14 buildings, all engulfed by a low granite wall. The amount of rock that had been used was extraordinary, but did not surprise him. Stone was intertwined with life here. Since times immemorial, people built their houses with it, removed it from their fields each year, used it to grind corn and wheat, and to cover their graves. His attention was drawn by a sudden movement at the left corner of the low wall. It was a large hare, one that scorned the nocturnal habits of its species. Noiselessly, Kufyam removed the rifle from his shoulder, loaded, and took aim. The hare was lethargic, as if already affected by the celebratory indolence, despite the distance from the village. Kufyam hesitated, the shooting posture still tainted by memories of the war. The hare moved slothfully, approaching a bunch of unripe oregano. Kufyam pressed the trigger, his need for a fresh offering dispersing a hint of regret. The smell of gunpowder was all-consuming, the clack of the gun all-pervading. The hare lay still, a hole showing in his left rib section. Kufyam gathered the still-warm carcass and headed into the complex. The smell of rot was heavy in the temple. He approached the icon and inspected his past offering. The bread had turned green, mold had spread, covered it, giving it the semblance of a moss-covered rock, another bone of the earth. He took the loaf outside and discarded it near the gravestones. He removed 2 candles from his sack and placed them on the stone floor on either side of the painting, jamming them into thin cracks. Between them was the square of cold earth, the spot he thought of as the temple's altar. He placed the hare carcass there, nailing the 3rd candle in the soil next to the animal. When he lifted his gaze to the image, he was taken aback. He thought that the face had somehow changed in an infinitesimal degree. It seemed a bit more robust, a bit more scarlet, as if a hint of life had been breathed upon it. Probably just a trick of the candlelight, he mused, but also an inauguration sign for the temple. He unveiled another prayer, a story he carried with him since his youth, the tale of a girl who cheated death by use of saintly bones. He returned after 2 evenings, drenched in cold rain. The hair had rotted, had almost shriveled with an unnatural haste. The change in the face of the painting was unquestionable. The color had become a tone healthier, and there seemed to be a bit of flesh now between skin and bones, as if some nourishment had flowed into the face. Mirroring the unnatural amelioration, the plants inside the temple had grown, the green of their leaves more lustrous. He crossed himself and stood in awe, before placing another offering of flesh upon the earth. Then he uttered the tale of Paraskeva, the blind female saint that had once been wandering the village nights, her rosary full of the eyes of ungodly burials. His visits to the ruins became more frequent. Kufyam craved to nurse his companion back to life, to health, to fill his body with nourishment. Each time he brought a new kill, a long-haired ram, a pair of ferrets, rock partridges, hares, and mallards. The land was bountiful in spring. He piled the offerings on the cold earth, upon the stone floor, among the blooming plants, deer and goats and glimmering serpents, side by side with hellebore, blackthorn, and vervain. Day by day, the temple scents ripened, touching on the putrescence of decaying flowers and the miasma of clogged blood. Each time he visited, he found the face in the painting more robust, his church enriched with spiny plants, with roots of stalwart, otherworldly aspect. Kufyam also longed to fill the spirit of his companion with what he knew of sanctity, the fears of his elders, the lore of wood and broken moon, of vengeful dead and the black earth. On each visit he prayed, offering stories of his ancestors, the village saints who still loomed in the dreams of the people and the land. After a month, the face had grown bloated, plump, stifling the silver frame. Standing before the portrait, his lithe frame dwarfed by the huge putrescent piles of rotten meat and vegetation that covered the temple grounds, Kufyam admired his work. He had nursed the man back to health, he had exalted him to panegyric sainthood. There was only one more thing to offer, one more prayer to tell, a tale not of the land, but of himself and of the man that stood painted before him, the man whose eyes were still closed, despite the long hours Kufyam had spent gazing at the rubric face, willing the flaccid, droopy eyelids open. He knelt, his right hand trembling with zeal and exultation. Once again his mind flew back to the time of his imprisonment. Kufyam remembered little of the dark period between the death of his fellow prisoner and his own release. It had been a time of feverish hunger, his thoughts a jumbled skein, death's pursuit relentless. During that time, a tale from his childhood kept coming back, coiling around his tongue, the story about a starving man who had entered the church one night to eat the dead flesh from the bones of a saint, for, as his grandmother had said, a saint is no more a man, but more akin to God or beast, both of whom we can partake of. Mad with hunger, Kufyam had sworn to himself that what he partook of was the flesh of a saint still unknown, a man whose sainthood loomed in the future. His liberators had been terrified when they had burst into the cell. Kufyam was barely alive, a scrawny thing. His nameless companion was a gnarled husk, his right arm a mutilated, mangled mess. As he had partaken, so he would give back. At the end of his narration, his last prayer and confession, Kufyam drove the blade fast, decisively, through his right wrist. His hand fell with a thud on the cold earth, amidst a scarlet shower. The man in the portrait, his saint of flesh, was gorging on the spectacle, his countenance vibrating as tears of pain obscured Kufyam's eyesight. He heard the heavy eyelids open slowly, as unseen hands moved, clenched. As he plunged into darkness, the last thing he saw were the phantoms of his grandmother and aunt, the women that had entwined his existence with terror, moving beside him, the whole land mirrored in their eyes. The two old women, dressed as midwives, came stooping out of the temple, supporting the maimed man between them. They had bandaged the stump of his right arm with star-embroidered linen, staunching the blood flow. They left him resting on one of the cisterns. When morning came, he would be able to slowly retrace his steps back towards the village. They re-entered the temple and sealed its openings with rags they had woven during the past month, patchworks of earth and night, of eyes of saints and pagan hands. They emerged, after 9 nights, cradling a plump newborn in their hands. The candle-lit village was waiting for them, woeful faces gazing at the newborn crescent moon.